Hello, everyone. Hello again. My name is Reginaldo Hazlet Marroquin. I'm with the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance, and I'm also part of an ecosystem of organizations, individuals, businesses that together we're trying to build a regenerative agriculture system for the United States with a focus on the Midwest at this point. And today I'll be talking to you about regenerative agriculture still, as before, and this time focused more on the management, the ecosystem management and organizing, but still looking at regenerative agriculture as an indigenous way of thinking. This is not something I came up with. Nobody currently in the modern times have come up with anything close to what the regenerative agriculture original purpose intended. That is an indigenous way of thinking, and it has been preserved by native communities across the world. Recognizing that and recognizing that on a regular basis, we are talking about these systems within the territories that have been expropriated from these communities and from which they have been pushed away through the process of colonization. It's critical that we think about that and recognize that as we try to embrace a new way of thinking, how do we organize regenerative systems needs to honor all of those considerations. Dismantling colonizing structures is actually not something that is done overnight. It took thousands of years to build the current colonizing system. Luckily for all of us, native communities across the world have continued to maintain pre-colonial uh, management, pre-colonial governance systems from which we can now learn as we come to the point of no return, where the colonizing structures have now become responsible for literally the destruction of the living organisms in the planet, and the possibility that we are coming to a point of collapse from which there is no return. So we have a responsibility to entering into a new stage in our own human evolution. And in that process, the last two presentations were dedicated to some of those fundamental concepts. Today, we're going to talk about a much higher level concept of governance, uh, ecosystem management from an indigenous perspective, governance perspective, which is going to be missed in a great way if you have missed the previous two presentations. So I recommend that you go back and review these concepts. First of all, the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance as an ecosystem of individuals. We are dedicated to building system level infrastructure that can deliver socially just, economically balanced, ecologically resilient, and especially spiritually grounded regenerative agriculture. And we have a shared mission to focus on supply chain with a further focus on regenerative poultry. We have a vision that we can make these systems the norm collectively with all of you. We have a strategy that is centered on managing ecosystems rather than making our organization the center of our purpose. Perpetuating our organization is not the objective of this strategy, but rather building an ecosystem which could, result in the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance becoming obsolete or having to be transformed into a new kind of institution for it to preserve its original purpose of serving as a real component of this ecosystem that delivers tangible results that contribute to the benefits of the collective regenerative agriculture system. To the extent that regenerative agriculture can continue to do that in tangible ways, measurable ways, then there's a room for it. To the extent that we achieve our goal of actually building a regenerative agriculture system, then there should be no need for the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance from a management perspective at an ecosystem level. And that is exactly the process of decolonization. To stop thinking about us as individuals and us as individual organizations, and rather to envision ourselves as part of this larger ecosystem and a part of a permanent governing structure where ownership, control of the system components, property, plant, equipment, land, all of those things are actually embraced under a new governance structure. So with that in mind, let's remember that we have some basic key concepts that we have to keep repeating. We're not going to read them through again, but go back and review our previous presentations on decolonization, on indigenization, and also on the countercultural and radical nature of decolonization, the subversive, the insurgent attributes of the commitments that are necessary to achieve a regenerative outcome, the revolutionary nature of the outcomes that we can achieve at a larger scale, the evolutionary components or the evolutionary nature of this process that is critical for us to continuously adapt to environmental incentivi or challenges or shock, whether it is climate shock or social shock or economic shock, so that the system can evolve, adapt, and continue to that resiliency. That's the evolutionary aspect. And of course, the combined destination, the combined outcome, which is an actual regenerative system destination. And again, this is more elaborated in the previous presentation, so we're not going to do that today. The energy management aspect and the structuring of what we do managerially or agronomically on the basis of natural blueprints that we inherited from creation itself. And our focus with the chicken as a way to illustrate how that process works, but not necessarily, this is not about chickens. This is just an example on how we have turned one area into an actual blueprint for how we can decolonize not only the processes, but the management, the science, and the mindset on how we approach design and agronomics and governance. So the chicken, a jungle animal that allows us to engage biological, chemical, and physical processes at a scale to transform energy from non-edible forms into edible forms, so that we can then close those energy loops as we go through the different components of a farming operation that delivers multitude of outcomes in the form of highly organized energy forms and expressions that at the end constitute what we call farming. This look at an energy cycle from different layers. So in a case of poultry, we are looking at ground level, below the ground, above the ground. And so it's really, regenerative agriculture is a four-dimensional concept. The three-dimensional nature of the world that we live in. So vertical, horizontal, sideways, below, all of that. It also is representative of the 7 cardinal points of many of the indigenous native traditions. The 7 cardinal points, including the traditional 4 cardinal points we are used to, which represent different forces, and then the above, the below, and the center. Those are the 3 other dimensional points, cardinal points that are normally missed when we don't start with a spiritual grounding as to how we are going to approach the process of building regenerative agriculture systems from farming all the way to governance. And so being able to indigenize that process requires that we see ourselves within a 4-dimensional conceptual framework, and the 4th dimension being the spirituality, which comes out of understanding the 7 cardinal points and understanding the 3-dimensionality of the fields that we work as farmers and so on. So with this in mind, we're going to move on to understanding also how those different components, farms can become regions, and regions can become components of a larger ecosystem. So in this case, looking at a poultry-centered regional deployment, it can engage up to 14, 20 enterprise sectors, more in some cases. The key is to look, and even this is not a system. This is still a subcomponent of a system, while the farm itself is really, as individually, is incapable of delivering the kind of ecological restoration and regeneration that is necessary, but is at the farm that the change starts to happen. And so for that farm to thrive, it needs layers and layers of support infrastructure so that we can actually build what eventually becomes a regenerative agriculture system rather than a production process which is what we normally talk about at a farm level. That system then organized into manageable components, just like we would do on a farm, managing, say, the poultry production at the larger scale regional level. We are looking at a sub-ecosystem component where we need to aggregate, say, farmers producing poultry or farmers producing vegetables and other sectors like poultry processing and grain producers and so on as components of a regional conglomerate that still represents the fundamental grassroots, ground up structuring of not only the production, aggregation, the mechanical aspects of it, but this way we don't lose all of the other dimensions to actually continue to build within an indigenized perspective, a decolonized perspective, so that we can fully integrate the holistic understanding of regenerative into the multi-layers of organizational processes. So the next layer then is building those regional efforts into an actual system, which is of national nature in the case of the United States and most countries around the world. So structural decolonization to achieve regenerative outcomes is really what we're going to focus today on. And this is really going from managing individual standalone organization to managing for ecosystem level structural change. A friend of mine recently asked me about his honey and his label, the label for his honey, not very different than, say, the label for my farm, Salvatierra Farms, or the label for many other individual farms. And he asked me to explain to him, so how do we handle that within this context of going from the individual, the standalone, into the collective managing of ecosystems and system level structures, so that we can actually achieve the structural change that delivers us the regenerative outcomes. And what I said to him was pretty simple. So you see your label for your farm, and that's very valuable. That is your identity. Don't think of that as a system. Think of that as an identity. That's who you are on your farm. My farm is going to produce regenerative poultry based on a system that I initiated and spearheaded, and then we have engineered collectively with a very large number of people from all the way from Guatemala, Mexico, British Columbia, Pine Ridge, Northern Minnesota, from all walks of life, all different folks coming in, including elders from the Pine Ridge Reservation, elders from Winnebago Reservation, from Guatemala and Mexico, communities and so on. All right. So, but at the end, even though I'm part of a larger ecosystem, my farm is my identity. That's my family's identity. And I don't want to lose that. And nobody should lose that. And nobody should put that up for grabs. But that doesn't make me a collective. Individually, I'm bound to fail. It is the way and the reason many individual farmers are failing. Now, whether an individual farmer fails in the conventional system is of no consequence to the overall system. Why? Because it just discards them and picks another one and gives them promises of a better future and all of those things and contracts and so on and so forth. And there is always somebody willing to take the place of the fallen one. Now, in regenerative agriculture, we don't accept that as a modus operandi. We don't accept failure. We accept challenges and we deal with them collectively. So if somebody is having difficulty with their farm, it is our collective responsibility to ensure that they don't lose that they deal with the situation they may be in the middle of. That is what it means to be part of a collective. But to be part of a collective, we first have to evaluate our individual identity and how it looks like in a collective identity. And we, in this case with the honey, the question was, are we willing to put our honey in the honey pot while keeping all the honey that we want for our family and for our friends, and maybe for those folks who are willing to buy directly from us, and so on and so forth, not necessarily at a system level, but at a project level, where people relate to us on a project basis. That, to me, is critical, and that identity needs to be preserved too. But the question is, if I produce more, or if I want to produce more, if I want to grow, and I want to do that as part of a collective rather than individualized colonizing model linear process. If I want to do that, I have to be willing to be part of the honeypot. And yes, it will still be my my honey. And yes, I will still get benefits from it. But there will be part of it that will be collectively built, wealth that will be collectively distributed, and I won't be able to pull my honey back out of the pot because it's no longer distinguishable. But it still carries my identity, and I can still track and document how much of that honey pot actually came from my identity, and I can be part of that. Now, if we can connect that way at multiple layers and can think of multiple layers from farm level, project-based level thinking, organizational level thinking, individual, all the way through those layers, then we will build the proper governance structures. So to look at the way we traditionally think of this structural colonization system. Most corporations, nonprofits, farms, and so on are structured to colonize. This is the expression of a colonized mind at work, building and perpetuating colonizing structures. In contrast to that, you have a decolonized system. This is the organizational infrastructure on which almost every native community governance system is organized under. And we're not talking about a few. In Guatemala alone, there is over 1,000 communities organized with this kind of decolonized governance system, where you have multiple layers of representation, where you grow your leaders, not elect them. You can elect them eventually, or you can select them, or you can have multiple levers for how somebody becomes a representative of your collective interest, which is really the definition of a leader. Somebody who represents the collective interest of their affinity group and does it with integrity. Integrity meaning it doesn't go out there to downplay, to negotiate, or to exchange the value that was entrusted by the collective to that individual. And this is why it has to be grown. Because somebody who doesn't know how to raise our poultry, for example, is not going to be able to represent the interest of the poultry grower. And some of us may move beyond raising poultry, and maybe we decide, well, listen, I did it for 10 years, and that's all I wanted to do. I don't want to grow poultry anymore, but I would like to stay in this ecosystem. Now I can graduate or grow into the next layer and represent the whole ecosystem. But I have the trust of everybody else because they also know that I did go through the same suffering and the same daily activities that they are going through. And they know that when I talk with them and when they talk with me as a representative of the trust in the interest of that collective, I understand firsthand what it's like to be a poultry grower. And so goes the layers. We can become part of the honeypot as well as we go layer, move beyond our individual farm operations. And so, but if we are organizing one of the outer circles, which would be, say, regional farmers who produce poultry in, say, the Northfield region. Now, that circle, we will elect a council to represent us for this region. That council has to be poultry producers. Why? Because they are the ones who actually represent our collective interest and understand what they are representing. And that's central. It's critical that we grow the current elders in the council, and then we grow the next generation. So there's young people coming in, and as they grow into it, they earn. It's a privilege to be the representative of a collective purpose. That privilege comes with a history, with a community backing, community validation. And it is very difficult to validate outsiders in this context. Many people are surprised when they go into Native communities and they feel rejected. They don't feel like they are welcomed in right away. They don't feel like they are trusted. Well, it's because community validation is very different than electing representation. And so this way of structuring a decolonized system means putting so many layers of checks and balances that it is almost uncorruptible, because there is so much accountability that someone, and the accountability comes from individuals who grew in the system, to the point, or not necessarily at the beginning, you have to become part of the system, of course. The new generation is going to grow into it. But in the present conditions, that you have gone through the processes and suffered or enjoyed, benefited from, and you got a vested interest on these principles to continue to be upheld. And when you walk away from it because of age, or because you moved on to another region, or another, you move from poultry, say, to pork, you carry that continuity and that conscience that is the grounding of the validity from which the community brings that validation to that person and trusts them with their collective interest and purpose, objectives, and mission. So those are really profound concepts of decolonizing governance, but we don't review that often enough to internalize them. And then it is the purpose of this ecosystem, as we build a regenerative agriculture system in the Midwest and beyond, to start these processes so that we start layering all of these different priorities and start managing them so that we can end at an uncompromising regenerative governance structure. The outer layer in structural change, as we look at organizing regenerative agriculture systems, that governance, ownership, and control, the outer layer that was in the diagram represents collective or ecosystem components. So these are not individual farmers. These are individual farmers who came together to create a collective that was grounded on common goals and common objectives. It could be many different expressions of identity. If I am from the LGBTQ community, that can be the identity I choose to create a collective. If I'm a Latin American, that may be the identity we choose, because we can identify with common goals and common objectives that are common denominators to all of us in that space. We decide that. Community organizing isn't something that somebody comes and does. Community organizing legitimately and with integrity is only possible when we decide to organize the community we live in. That is community organizing. So let's not get confused with the traditional, more in between, colonized and decolonized structures that we normally accept as community organizing. When so-called community organizers come into our space to organize us, that is not community organizing. That is another form of colonization that we need to resist and we need to expose if we're going to be accountable and actually build the future that we actually envision that is actually regenerative. So that's why, first point, these circles represent a collective, an ecosystem component. Ecosystem component meaning part of the larger ecosystem, all of those other circles that we were talking about. It is a community-defined circle or collective. It's defined by common goals and common objectives. They may relate to farming or maybe to another kind of identity. Just like I said about, maybe it's a Hmong farmers collective, maybe it's Latin American farmers collective, maybe it's an African Americans farmers collective. And they may not care about what kind of farming they do, just the fact that they are farmers and that they have some identity component that they want to be reflected in their console so that it is validated and represented, such as the fact that I am a Latin American, and as a Latin American I encounter a very specific set of circumstances that African Americans don't and that white folks don't. And so, and I'm not judging, I'm not saying that, I encounter more difficulties than them or less than me or anything like that. All I'm saying is we have a common purpose here, a common denominator that we can organize behind. And if it's going to benefit us individually, then many of us are going to be more motivated to organize and to be part of that council and to go and represent ourselves. We don't need to have any more than our own self-interest in that case to organize a collective. So there is a balance between building decolonized structures and sustaining some of that individual interest, which is part of our colonizing mentality and the colonizing nature of all of us. All of us are born with that, and we need to capitalize on it, and we need to manage it, but ensuring that the colonizing nature we're born with doesn't overtake the indigenous nature that we are also born with, which defines us as individuals of the earth rooted in the earth, real expressions of energy floating to the universe that came through from the soil that eventually gave birth to us. It isn't as if we didn't come from the soil, if you think about it. When we were all in our mother's womb, our mothers were feeding from the soil. They were eating carrots and eating chicken and eggs, which were grown on a farm, which came from carbon in the atmosphere, from elements that were transformed by the biodiversity of the soil, the biodynamics of it, the biological systems. That is where we came from. We came literally from the soil. We are indigenous to the earth, to the elements in the earth. That we are also born with. And if we recognize that and balance that out with our individual need to control, to survive, our more innate version of ourselves, we will be able to bring both of them for the purpose of building and creating a more regenerative future. When we don't balance those things out, the colonizer will take over, because the colonizer is violent, is extractive, it destroys, and it will overcome the other 90% of us, which wants to be indigenous, because that part is peaceful. That part of us is compassionate, is tolerant, is the stronger part of us, but is the less violent of us. And violence in those cases can overtake. There's books, there's theories of change, and there is all forms of societal takeovers that have been structured and modeled after that understanding of our nature. So as we think of organizing and ownership, governance, control, and we think about the structures we are going to create, these circles show us one of those, that outer layer, which then we will build on concentrically until we get to the center, where is the optimal expression of who we actually are as human beings. So understand and capitalize on the value and benefit of organizing. Again, the community collective as the center of that circle. An individual farmer must find an affinity group. So if I'm just a farmer who doesn't really want to be associated with, say, our poultry system. We have a poultry system that many farmers are adopting. And so it gives us that affinity. It gives us that common purpose, because we have a system that we have standardized. And as we standardize it, it allows us to scale. It allows us to brand collectively, to own collectively, to build wealth collectively, and all of that. But there may be a farmer who says, well, I want to raise chickens, but I don't want to be part of that. Well, there could be a collective of farmers who are growing chickens, who are not part of this collective, but also feel that they need their own representation, and they should as well organize their own collective. Individually, however, they can't be part of a collective. That is simply the definition of it. So organize, and then organize some more. That is the concept of retaking the ownership and control and governance of the regenerative poultry system. Without that, it's just going to get whitewashed and washed out, and it's going to go by the roadside, just like many other brilliant and incredible ancestral knowledge and inheritance that we have received from other communities. So, structural change, organizing regenerative agriculture, first tier organizing layer, those brown circles, and again, that's arbitrary, just to give some color to this. For example, the regenerative poultry farmers could be one of those consoles. The Latin American regenerative poultry farmers. I can be on one or two or three of those circles. I may be on one console or in one circle, collectively coordinating with everybody who does regenerative poultry under our standardized system, independently of whether they are Hmong or African Americans or white or Latin Americans or whatever, right? That's one collective I could be part of. But aside from that, there's a lot of Latin American farmers like me who we as a group face very specific areas of challenges that we need to resolve. So we come together as another collective and create a different kind of representation so that those issues don't get lost. Same as Hmong farmers. there is many others that you can read through, and now your imagination is really the limit as to how many different consoles or different clusters or different circles can be included into this governance. There is no exclusivity. Everybody should feel like they have a representation somewhere, like they can join a collective. And if they don't, they will be encouraged, and they need to be encouraged to build a collective of those who think and have similar common denominators as their own. The second tier is really bringing those different sectors together with another level of affinity. So we are talking about, for example, all the regenerative poultry producers councils, from the Latin Americans, the African Americans, the inclusive producer poultry farmers in southeastern Minnesota, for example, bringing those together into a regional council, inclusive of all the multiple identity circles. It could be the LGBTQ, it could be the African American farmers, there could be the Latin American farmers, all of them, but again, with that common denominator of that they are all regenerative poultry producers. And that creates a second tier of organizing without losing the continuity of the representation. Similar could be done for pork. Again, multiplicity of circles organize themselves as a council. Grass-fed beef council, same thing. Urban gardening council, financial institutions council from specific regions. So take all of the financial institutions interested in regenerative ag and say Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. And those come together as a regional second tier layer of governance so that they can actually find their own space to be represented in the larger ecosystem of regenerative agriculture. And then comes the third tier, which is really bringing together regions where you bring the financial folks, you bring all the second tier councils into a larger council that can represent everybody from farmers all the way through all the other layers, so that we can actually build manageable governance representation, because everybody can't be sitting at a table. Otherwise we just become paralyzed by the scale of the amount of people that need to be part of a system level governance. So this way it allows us not to reduce, but to consolidate the representation and multi-tier layers. At the third layer is where we actually bring that larger representation where it can then move into what at this point we're calling the Regenerative Agriculture Congress. We can call it anything we want going forward. We can put any colors we want on this. We can build as many circles as we want and as many circles are necessary to make sure that everybody is included, no matter what their background is, as long as they are willing to move from the individual interest into responding and working through a set of collective principles and collective interests. That collectivity is fundamental for achieving a decolonized governance system. And so that's the center of the whole ecosystem. That ecosystem, that center, is what holds the maximum authority, as is known in ancestral governance. Now, the beauty of it is that it's got multiple redundancies, multiple levels of accountability, multiple checks and balances. This is not about a single or two. It's not a group holding another accountable. It's about every group being able to focus on their area of expertise, interest, and commonality, but also sitting down with others who similarly represent other sectors and then holding each other accountable. Technically here, there is no everybody's accountable to everyone. The Congress is a form of forms multiple commissions that focus on specific ecosystem functions. So, for example, we don't have to do conferences anymore. We don't have to have 100 different, scattered regenerative conferences. We can now have, looking backwards into the past, imagine we are 10 years from now and we have accomplished this. We can now have a governance convergence instead. And every single sector now feels included. And they, within that convergence, They can have their own sub-ecosystem or sector sub-conversions where they can actually discuss their regional, their tier, common interest. And so can also the regional farmers can have their own space to have their own convergence. Starting with, for example, in an annual convergence, one first day could be the governance business. So for a full day, all of these layers of representation could discuss the platform, the foundation of the Congress, and how it represents all of the layers and how we manage this, and on it goes. And also to validate documents that are that hold the central governing principles, the Book of Knowledge, as it's called, all the Ukushwuch, that Carta Magna of the regenerative agriculture system needs to be validated and put through the whole system. So everyone needs to be on that one day. And then for the next 2 to 3 days of the convergence, everybody goes and exchanges information. Have parties if that's what you want to have. Sell products if that's what you want to do. But do the things that matter to you and to your sector of the ecosystem. That's what delivers tangible benefits, real things, real motivation for continuing to organize, to build energy, knowing that someone has your back, knowing that the system is not corruptible easily. And then, as an ecosystem, we can select those commissions, like the annual convergence, knowledge exchange, so that somebody coordinates the different people who want to share. They are eager to share with other folks. The poultry folks sharing with the pork folks, and the pork folks sharing with others, as long as there is interest and there is a call and so on. Government relations. Now imagine for a second what we will do and what we have done 10 years from now in the future. With government relations, the Midwest is 12 states. Minnesota alone has 25 million acres of land. There is almost 100,000 farmers in Minnesota. If we collectively built a Congress, a regenerative agriculture Congress for 12 states, organize ourselves according to proven, time-tested, war-tested, 36 years of civil war in Guatemala was unable to undo these fundamental principles of governance. And it allowed for communities, whole communities, to regenerate after being devastated, decimated by the war. This is real, folks. This is the future of regenerative agriculture governance. Regenerative agriculture isn't a label, isn't a brand, isn't how you till the ground, isn't about biology, isn't about all those things that some folks want to reduce regenerative into. Regenerative agriculture is a way to relate to all the other organisms on this ecosystem we are so blessed with. Is the way we relate to each other, is the way we organize, is the way we govern, is the way we take ownership and control collectively. That is regenerative agriculture. So I invite you all to think about this very high level, I know, very short introduction to decolonizing governance, to decolonizing ownership and control of the land, of our own minds, freeing ourselves to be really fully who we're meant and designed to be by the evolutionary processes of the earth itself. We are better. We are capable. We have potential. We are at the right time. We have the right crossroads. We have the will at this point. We have woken up from 4 years of a nightmarish period in our history in this country. We should know better at this point than to go back to the old, obsolete, colonizing ways of thinking and doing things. So I know this is not the whole story. This is just laying out the possibilities. We have to build this. Nobody individually does. We collectively have to turn this from what I just shared with you into the future of the Midwest. And as a result of that, acquire the collective power, influence, and capability to demand the changes that are necessary for us to not kill ourselves as we deal with nature and as we cause this massive disruption of the climate, which is resulting directly in our own demise. We need to stop begging for the changes. We can make them happen. So with that in mind, I hope this gives you enough energy. I was born an insurgent. I will always be an insurgent, a pacifist insurgent, an intellectual insurgent, all kinds of forms of insurgency that we need to now call in from our inner selves and put out there and start reflecting on the greater part, the greater potential that we were all born with as indigenous people, but also as colonizers, and bring that into balance and put it out there and turn this ecosystem we inherited into the next form of evolution, of not only as humans, but also as part of this larger living system that we are part of. So with that in mind, I hope you have a great 15 minutes of discussion here, and we'll talk next time. Thank you.